Good morning, Little Masters, and welcome back to today's Tolkien Times, a Prancing Pony podcast production. I'm the Man of the West, and after spending Series 12 looking at artifacts in the Third Age, we've spent this series looking at different cultures of men of the Third Age. So far, though, it's all been the Men of Darkness, aside from that little bit in the first week when we looked at the difference between High Men, Middle Men, or Men of the Twilight, and the Men of Darkness. We've talked a little bit about the Variags of Khand, and then we spent 2 weeks on the Easterlings before turning our gaze southward as we began our study of the Haradrim of the First and Second Ages last week. Today, we look at the Haradrim, or Southrons, in the Third Age. And we'll start in Umbar this time, but not with the Corsairs, who we'll talk about soon enough, although there will necessarily be some crossover, as you'll see. Because the Corsairs of Umbar don't exist in Third Age 933, when King Eärnil I repaired the ancient haven of Pelargir and built a great navy. He laid siege by sea and land to Umbar and took it, and it became a great harbor and fortress of the power of Gondor. Now, the footnote to that passage gives us some very important detail. The great cape and landlocked firth of Umbar had been Númenórean land since days of old, but it was a stronghold of the King's Men, who were afterwards called the Black Númenóreans, corrupted by Sauron, and who hated above all the followers of Elendil. After the fall of Sauron, their race swiftly dwindled or became merged with the men of Middle-earth, but they inherited without lessening their hatred of Gondor. Umbar, therefore, was only taken at great cost. And this is where some of that crossover with the Black Númenóreans comes into play. Some of the lords that had been driven from Umbar led the men of the Harad, who came up with great power against that stronghold, killing Círgendil, the son of Eärnil. Now that led to a standoff between Gondor and the Harad, as we read, "For many years Umbar was invested," and that word has an archaic meaning, surrounded in order to besiege or blockade. So the men of Harad had surrounded the city, now back to the text, but could not be taken because of the sea power of Gondor. Círgeir, son of Círgendil, bided his time, and at last, when he had gathered strength, he came down from the north by sea and by land, and crossing the river Harnan, his armies utterly defeated the men of the Harad, and their kings were compelled to acknowledge the overlordship of Gondor in the year Third Age 1050. Now, Damrod, one of the rangers of Ithilien watching over Frodo and Sam, actually refers to this time, explaining, "'Tis said that there were dealings of old between Gondor and the kingdoms of the Harad in the far south, though there was never friendship. In those days our bounds were away south beyond the mouths of Anduin, and Umbar, the nearest of their realms, acknowledged our sway. But that is long since. 'Tis many lives of men since any passed to or fro between us." They did more than just acknowledge the sway of Gondor, or the overlordship, as that paragraph earlier mentioned. Círgeir, the king who utterly defeated the Haradrim, became known as Haermendikil, South Victor, and the kings of the Harad did homage to Gondor, and their sons lived as hostages in the court of its king. Now, we don't hear anything from the Haradrim for quite some time after this, about 400 years. But after the kin strife in Gondor, when Castamir the Usurper was killed in Third Age 1447, his sons fled to Umbar, creating the Corsairs of Umbar. Now, we'll learn more about them in a couple of weeks, but for this story, the story of the Haradrim, it suffices to know that the Haradrim were allied with the Corsairs. Now, eventually, in Third Age 1810, Telumektar took Umbar one more time, but that didn't last. The appendices tell us that in the new evils that soon befell Gondor, Umbar was again lost and fell into the hands of the men of the Harad. Now, when we talked about the Easterlings, we looked at their alliance in Third Age 1944, in which King Ondahare and his sons were killed. Here's what the appendices have to say about this. Many of the Wain riders now passed south of Mordor and made alliance with men of Khand and of Near Harad. And in this great assault from north and south, Gondor came near to destruction. In 1944, King Ondahare and both his sons, Artamir and Faramir, fell in battle north of the Morannon, and the enemy poured into Ithilien. But Eärnil, captain of the southern army, won a great victory in South Ithilien and destroyed the army of Harad that had crossed the river Poros. So the Haradrim lose that battle, but it wasn't the last time Gondor would hear from them. In the days of Beren, the 19th steward, that's Third Age 2758, an even greater peril came upon Gondor. 3 great fleets, long prepared, came up from Umbar and the Harad and assailed the coasts of Gondor in great force, and the enemy made many landings, even as far north as the mouth of the Isen. By the way, this was also the year of the long winter and the death of Helm of Rohan. Now, a little over 100 years after that, the Haradrim made perhaps their biggest inroads. The appendices tell us that in the days of Turin II, the enemies of Gondor began to move again, including the Haradrim. In fact, they say that Turin's chief peril lay in the south, where the Haradrim had occupied South Gondor, and there was much fighting along the Poros. The Haradrim were able to invade Ithilien in great strength in 3rd Age 2885, but they were eventually defeated when the Rohirrim fulfilled the Oath of Eorl. This would lead to the battle at the crossing of the Poros and the death of the twin sons of Folquina. And we'll visit this location soon on a Middle-earth Map Monday, in fact. We don't see the Haradrim again until the War of the Ring, where they fight alongside Sauron and his orcs. They are in the leading forces that attack Osgiliath on June 20th, beginning the war, and their forces continue to come north through Ithilien to Mordor. The army, ambushed by Faramir and the Rangers of Ithilien, is a Haradrim army. And that's where I want to go back to the text, to remind us of something that might be easy to forget in all these weeks talking about the men of darkness. They're not orcs. They're still men. Let's look at this through Sam's eyes. Sam, eager to see more, went now and joined the guards. He scrambled a little way up into one of the larger of the bay trees. For a moment, he caught a glimpse of swarthy men in red running down the slope some way off, with green-clad warriors leaping after them, hewing them down as they fled. Arrows were thick in the air. Then, suddenly, straight over the rim of their sheltering bank, a man fell, crashing through the slender trees nearly on top of them. He came to rest in the fern a few feet away, face downward, green arrow feathers sticking from his neck below a golden collar. His scarlet robes were tattered. His corselet of overlapping brazen plates was rent and hewn. His black plaits of hair, braided with gold, were drenched with blood. His brown hand still clutched the hilt of a broken sword. It was Sam's first view of a battle of men against men, and he did not like it much. He was glad that he could not see the dead face. He wondered what the man's name was, and where he came from, and if he was really evil of heart, or what lies or threats had led him on the long march from his home, and if he would not really rather have stayed there in peace. And the rest of the story is going to have to wait. I thought I'd get through the Haradrim in 2 weeks, but they're such an important presence in the siege of Gondor and the Battle of the Pelennor Fields that we will have to come back to them next week. So folks, thank you for joining me for this week's Third Age Thursday. Be sure to come back tomorrow as we conclude the story of Tuor and his coming to Gondolin on First Age Friday. Check out patreon.com/Tolkien Times to learn how you can support the show, get an ad-free feed, join my content council, get a bonus episode every week, and more. Subscribe to the TTT in your podcast apps or here on the PPP channel on YouTube. Be sure you're following @PrancingPonyPod on social media. And finally, as Faramir says, go with the goodwill of all good men.